this is Alli Kerr from allikerr.com, and I am here with Mr. Rick Caselge. And Rick is someone who has been really working in the injury world and really helping people as far as how to use exercise to prevent or help injuries that we may already have. So I'm going to let Rick tell us a little bit more about his history and who he is. So thanks for being on today, Rick. So tell us a little bit about what you do.
Awesome, Alli. So my name is Rick Caselge. What I specialize is in helping people overcome injury and pain. So many years ago, I used to work in a gym, and what happened in the gym was you would have people coming in, and the people that had complex injuries and pain, none of the other trainers wanted to do. So I had an interest in injury and pain and what you can do, what to do to overcome injury and pain. So I ended up getting those clients. So I ended up becoming the expert on what you should do in the gym when it comes to exercises for specific injuries like neck, back, shoulder, and knee pain. Well, in 2008, I started a blog where I wrote about injuries and pain, and people around the world started finding the blog, and then they started asking me if I had programs when it came to dealing with different types of injuries. So I took my workouts that I did in the gym for people, and then I brought them online, and now I've mainly been online, helping people all over the world when it comes to my blog, my YouTube channel, and my daily newsletter where I talk about overcoming injury and pain. So that's a little bit about me, like more of the background stuff. I did my kinesiology degree up here in Canada. I'm called a kinesiologist. I've worked in a gym setting, but I've also worked in physical therapy clinics, chiropractic clinics, large rehab centers, community centers, gyms, fitness centers, all specializing in that injury and pain thing. And I've been doing that since 1995. And after a couple of years, I went and did my master's degree in exercise rehabilitation, where I did my master's project on rotator cuff injury and recovery. So that's kind of about me. I've really just focused on overcoming pain and injury since like 95, and I'm going to continue on doing that for forever.
Forever. Well, that's awesome. And you do have so many resources. Just going to your website, and I want to know, because you've been doing this so long and you work with so many different people and so many different issues, why do you think we have so many joint issues?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I think there's many, but if I kind of looked at like the top three, I mean, number one would be, people are overweight, and probably being overweight. That ends up playing a huge role when it comes to your joints. And I was reading something yesterday where they talked about 10 pounds. So adding 10 pounds to your body weight increases the stress on your knee joints by 30 to 60 pounds. Now, it doesn't seem like much, but just if you go in the gym and you grab like a 60-pound dumbbell, it's some weight. It's some weight. So just being overweight ends up having a big effect on your joints, especially the lower body, foot, ankle, knee, hip, and back. Well, okay, what about the shoulder and neck area? Well, that ends up being like the second thing. It ends up being your posture. Posture ends up having a big effect on you. And posture oftentimes relates to all of our sitting that we end up doing. So with the sitting, we end up rounding out our shoulders. We end up bringing our heads forward and moving our heads away from our body. And now with that, roughly the head ends up being about 10 pounds. And every inch that you move it forward, you end up increasing the force on the neck, and also the spine by 10 pounds. So if your head is forward an inch from where it should be, instead of it being 10 pounds, it's actually putting 20 pounds of pressure in your neck and spine. So that ends up being the second one, ends up being posture. And then the third one ends up being just repetitive movements. And the repetitive movements can be the work that we end up doing, the activity we end up doing. Let's say we might be really good and we might be working out, but if we're always doing the same workout, if we're always doing the same modality, and what I mean by that is a group fitness class all the time, or if we're always doing machines, or if we're doing is like CrossFit workouts, I mean, that ends up, that repetitive, constant same movement or same type of movement, the body ends up adapting to. It's very much like the analogy of, bodybuilder might be great in the weight room part of the gym, but you throw him into a pool and he's like like a fish out of water. So, doing the same thing over and over again, adding some variety ends up being important.
So what age do we typically see people starting to experience joint issues?
That's a real good question. Like being in this since '95, a lot of times it was older adults. I mean, and I hate saying older because I'm entering that older category, which I used to call people in their 20s. So I'm in my 40s, but a lot of times what I see is as soon as you start getting in your 30s, what they say is you're starting to see joint changes within the joint, and with time, you end up getting more and more injuries. Now, but also a trend that I'm seeing with clients is I'm seeing a lot of younger clients in their teens as well. But I would say the vast majority of people in your 20s, you tend to be bulletproof. And then in the 30s, the aches and pains happen. The 40s, there's aches and pains that hold you down. And then your 50s, 60s, and 70s, it kind of, you end up getting two or three or four, 5 different types of chronic condition, joint condition, tissue injuries and pain that you have to kind of be aware of, work around, deal with.
Yeah, I definitely, working with women, see it, and we're seeing it in the 20s. We definitely see it in the 40s and older, definitely in the 50s and 60s, but even into the 20s. So yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and it really ends up being gender specific. Like a lot of people go, "Hey, what's the most common injury you hear about?" And it really, I find it is, back tends to cover both, both genders, and a lot of times, I find with men it tends to be a muscle imbalance issue. A lot of times when it relating to a flexibility issue. With females, it tends to be a stability issue. So the right muscles turning on at the right time for the right length of time to protect their joints. But then if we look at other injuries, like shoulder joints tend to be most common in men, knee injuries tend to be most common in women.
Wow. Yeah, and we see that. We also see a pretty good bit in women as far as shoulders, oddly enough, too, but definitely the knees. Absolutely the knees.
Yeah, but I mean, with women, a lot of times that will stem back to, if they've had kids, how they've ended up carrying their kids on one side. That ends up doing it. Posture ends up being another thing. That rounded posture thing just decreases how much space that shoulder has, and then a lot of times the decrease in space bites into that rotator cuff, and then something ends up happening with the rotator cuff because 3/4 of shoulder injuries relate to the rotator cuff dysfunction.
Yeah, absolutely. And as far as things we can do to prevent, we typically think of doing therapy or some kind of exercise for our bodies. Unfortunately, a lot of times we don't think about that until we have some issue. We don't. So what can we do because therapy a lot of times is exercise. So what can we do to prevent that?
One of my old companies before when I started this in '95, my company was healing through movement. So really, movement was like healing, and it helped when it came to overcoming injuries and pain. So a lot of times it's just adding movement ends up helping, and kind of building on that. When it comes to injuries and pain, restoring movement in that area ends up being a big thing. So let's say with the knee, a lot of people want to do like squats, and that's painful. But what you need to do is step back and make sure you got that as much range of motion as you can. So lying on your back and trying to bring your knees to chest, and then straightening out your leg as much as you can, trying to get as much range of motion as you can ends up being important. But then also looking at trying to get the mobility going in all the joints. So let's say a lot of times, let's go with the knee, a lot of time tightness, like locked up hips and locked up ankles end up affecting negatively in the knee. Irritation, pain, and then a full-blown injury. Because when the body ends up moving, if certain areas are stiff, other areas have to pick up the slack. And that's what ends up happening when it relates to the knee. So we've got trying to maintain full range of motion, trying to work on mobility. Then the other thing is like working on stability, like the muscles that provide stability, protection, and strength for those joints, especially the big ones. We look at the neck. So with forward head posture, a lot of times we have having an imbalance in the deep muscles in the neck that stabilize the neck and keep us in that good posture. If we look at the shoulder joint, all those shoulder blade muscles are important in stability. If we look in the hip, there's muscles that help with stability. The back, we have the core, and then even with the knee and the foot, there's muscles when it relates to stability. Then the next thing would be the fourth would be like adding movement, whole body movement. So walking ends up being great. Like if I had to pick between walking and biking, I would choose walking because that ends up being a whole body movement that you end up doing. Now, biking's not a bad thing, and never ever bike. But if I had a choice, I'd probably pick an activity that I can get whole body movement from. And when it comes to walking, like getting to a point where you're working, like that you're feeling a glow, a light sweat, like you can't have like a leisurely conversation is what I'm looking at. And then and then lastly would be adding some strength. When you age, probably the most important thing that you can end up doing is just having strength. Adding muscle and having strength will help like so much when it relates to a wide variety of injuries. So it'd be kind of those 5 things that I would end up addressing. It does sound like a lot, but it's not. It isn't when you kind of break it down.
Yeah, and one of the things that I hear, and I'm sure you've heard, sometimes people are afraid to exercise if they have something going on joint-wise. So do you think that, can you speak to that as far as that fear of exercising when you have joint problems?
Oh, I think that's just the worst advice. That is just the worst advice. I mean, I understand why people get that.
Yeah.
And I understand why that thought process is out there. Like, oh, if it hurts, don't move it. And that's true. If a bone is like sticking out of your arm and there's blood everywhere, then definitely don't move it. It's just going to make it worse. But if you have some like joint pain, if you're able to do your daily activities and something's bothering you a little bit, or if something is like having to force you to maybe take a break from, that doesn't mean like totally avoid it. So I honestly, just going back to that healing through movement, like movement ends up helping. Meaning, my back might be sore, and if I have a sore back, I'm probably not going to do 1 rep max back squats. Probably not. It's probably a bad idea. But I probably want to work on, working on the mobility, the range of motion, stability stuff when it comes to around my back. So doing body weight squats, prisoner squats, full body weight squats would probably be fine for me. Even if it's really sore, I can just limit that to a half or a quarter squat. So I'm getting some movement going on. So I would try to keep moving those areas, because if you completely rest, yeah, it helps with recovery. Resting is an important component when it comes to recovery. But then a lot of times what will happen is, if we go back to that comment I made when it comes to increasing your weight. So let's say I've got knee pain and I'm just told not to do anything. Well, I'm not going to do anything. I'm probably going to eat more. I'm going to probably move less. My weight's going to increase. Well, now I've got an increase of 30 to 60 pounds of force in my knees. So guess what? The pain's going to be worse. I'm going to get more irritation. I'm probably going to make my injury even worse. So it ends up being that vicious cycle. But if you try to do what you can, or focus on activities that put less stress, so instead of running, maybe walking. Instead of walking, maybe getting into the pool or swimming or getting on the bike. There's less impact on the bike, or an elliptical trainer. With the bike and the elliptical trainer, we get to pros and cons, but the benefit with low impact might be might be more beneficial than the strong focus on hip movement. So my big philosophy is always that you can modify your exercise to the injury you have, the point of recovery you are in when it comes to your injury. And you can, even if it's really bad, you can always work around it. Like, I love going to the gym and you see the guy or the gal with like the big air cast on,
Yes.
and they blown their ankle or they blown their Achilles tendon, and they're still on their bike lane. Like, that's the way to do it. Like, you haven't slowed down. Or let's say they've torn up their knee and they're on the upper body bike, still getting their like the arm crank thing. I'm like, that's how you do it. You just work around it. I mean, work around it, modify to it. I don't believe you do nothing with an injury. I think that's just bad advice.
That one always gets me. So
it's just
so
bad.
much better to move than to not. I call it getting stove up. Your body just gets tighter and stove up. And hip flexors, you're an expert in the area of hip flexors. So tell us what those are, and with our lifestyle today, how those get affected.
Yeah, I mean, if we go back to that point that I was talking about where you're trying to increase the mobility, and the mobility, so we talked about range of motion and we talked about mobility, and range of motion is having the full movement within that joint. Trying to bring your heel to your seat, that's ideally, and then straighten your leg. Then we're looking at mobility is like how well the joint ends up moving. And so with the knee ends up being a bad example. The knee really, ideally, if we kind of eliminate all the micro movements, it really bends forward and back, and it can't really do much more. But if we end up going into the hip ends up moving in all directions. So it moves forward and back, it moves side to side, it rotates, and then you have a combination of those three movements. So it ends up increasing to way more movements, but just three primary movements it does. So we need to make sure that we end up having good mobility in the hips. So with us and a big part of it is just our lifestyle, like with how much sitting we end up doing. Our hip flexors end up tightening up. With all that sitting, the joints, the hip joints, end up not working properly. So those hip areas end up being locked up. And just like I mentioned earlier in the interview, is that locked up hip area ends up putting more stress on different areas. And different areas will have to pick up the slack. So knees will have to pick up the slack. Your back ends up having to pick up your slack. And even if we have like a locking up of the hip, there'll be an effect in the shoulder, and there'll end up being an effect in the head. So, what I find with people and what really helps is those hip flexors and that hip kind of ends up being, pretty much the center of the body. And what we want to do is unlock that area. And it's not just as simple as, hey, let's just not sit. Sometimes that's not realistic because, even going to a sit and stand, or moving to a standing desk, well, that kind of creates other things because now you're putting more stress on your lower body. So a balance between the two ends up being important. And then when it comes to, kind of how to unlock them, I find you need to utilize like a sequential flow. So not stretching, I found, since playing around with this since 1995, isn't enough. You end up needing to utilize a wide variety of modalities to unlock those hip flexors. I kind of talked about some of them. Working on range of motion, working on the mobility, working in multi-planes, working on stability is kind of the start when it comes to unlocking those hip flexors. And I found a lot of people end up having outstanding benefits when it comes to how loose they feel when they move, how it decreases their back pain, how it decreases their hip pain and knee pain, how they're able to increase their performance when it comes to squatting, or how intense they're able to go in their workouts. So it's really been like the number one kind of routine that I can take people through in order to get the most benefit from their bodies.
And even I know as women, of course we're vain and we care about how we look. So how does that, can you tell us what kind of problems we might have as far as the way we look from having our hip flexors being too tight? What is that going to look like?
All right, one more time. I missed the question. Sorry.
So as women, we're very vain and we like to, look good. So how does
Yeah.
having tight hip flexors, how does that affect the way that we actually look?
Oh, okay. So it ends up affecting your posture. A lot of times when you end up having tight hip flexors, your pelvis will tilt forward. So you end up getting like a pooch or a belly.
Yes,
That's what ends up happening.
the
So
belly
instead of
too.
having those nice curves in your body, you end up having a bigger curve in your back, and then you end up having the kind of that pooch or belly that ends up occurring when it comes to females,
And
and
we
that's
don't like
because of the
that.
hip flexors tightening up.
Yeah, we don't like that look as
No, you
females.
don't like that. No, no, ladies don't like that.
Yeah.
And that ends up being a hip flexor tightness, and then hip flexor tightness with the change in the pelvis ends up affecting like the core or abdominal area as well.
Yeah. So like I said, you've actually been working on the hip flexor and obviously all the different joints of the body, but you've actually got a product now that addresses the tight hip flexors and actually you talked about unlocking them and your product is designed to do that. So can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, you bet. So people were starting to hear about the results that I was getting, with clients and with myself when it comes to kind of doing this, really research-backed, strategic, simple, sequential flow. And they were asking, if I could put it into like a routine and put it in a format that people can, access and get. So what I ended up, flying down to Tampa Bay and meeting up with my business partner, Mike Westerdahl, and we ended up filming this sequence. So um, I ended up taking a person through the routine and kind of explaining things and the 10 different exercises and how to do things correctly and right in order to get the most benefit from it in the shortest amount of time. So roughly it ends up being about 10 exercises or movements, as I call them, in this sequential flow that takes about 10 minutes that really targets your hip flexors and your hips in order to really unlock them and really unlock kind of like the potential within your body.
So and who could do this? Is this something that someone my age can do? Who is it really designed to target?
Really, it's kind of targeted to everybody. I mean, I found that teens and people in their 20s, a lot of times they're sitting way more. Their hips are end up locked up, so they can end up benefiting from it as well. I've also had people in their 70s go through the routine and find it benefit them when it comes to helping with their movement, decreasing their hip pain, decreasing their back pain. So really, a lot of people can end up benefiting from it. So if people end up sitting lots, it's usually you're kind of a prime candidate to have benefit from Unlock Your Hip Flexors, which is the name of the program.
Unlock your hip flexors. I love
Unlock Your Hip
it.
Flexors.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that and I think it's becoming a term that people are hearing a little bit more because we do so much sitting.
Yeah.
Can you tell us though, for those that may not know, before we close here, where the hip flexors are on the
Oh, if
body?
we look at the hip flexor, so if I look at the front of my hips, so if I look at where the hip joint is, so if I'm standing and I stand on one leg and I bring my knee up, I can see where that bend is, and so that ends up being the hip joint. If I put my finger in there and I press down and kind of work, if I have any fat, work around that fat until you get to the muscle, and you push down on it, you can end up feeling the hip flexor. So that hip flexor, just like that little test I showed you, stand on one leg and bring the knee up. That's what the hip flexor does. It's designed to bring the thigh forward and at the hip joint. So with us sitting so much, you're kind of in that position. So those muscles end up tightening up. So it ends up being two muscles. So you end up having your psoas and iliacus, and they're kind of blended together, but then they're also two different muscles. So one ends up that you can end up feeling part of it, and the other one is a lot deeper in there, like up against your pelvis. So it's those two different muscles that you end up needing to target in order to kind of unlock your hip flexors. But the big thing is you got to get to them first.
Yeah.
So you can't just go there and just do a hip flexor stretch. You need to kind of unravel things around that hip,
Mm-hmm.
and then you need to kind of target things appropriately.
Absolutely. So yeah, just to clarify, it's on the front of the hip flexors on the front, because we think hip. A lot of times we think about hips being in the back. So
that's true.
yeah,
That's true.
yeah.
Bring your hips back. Yeah,
Yeah.
like with that cue that I use and that I've heard. Yes, it's in the front. They're in the
Mm-hmm.
front of the hip.
And so if people, what I'm going to do, I will actually put a link to your Unlock Your Hip Flexors program for people that are interested in that sequence. So if they want to get the sequence so they can actually do the flows, so it's 10 exercises, takes about 10 minutes. They can actually go below this video, and I'll have a link there so that people can go and access your program and that sequence that you have.
Awesome. That sounds good.
Yes, thank you so much, Rick. I really appreciate you doing this interview, and thank you for all that you do for all of our joints and educating us and helping us with exercises.
No worries. So I mean, people should definitely check out that link that you have below this video. But then also, if people want to get a little bit more information about myself, swing by exercisesforinjuries.com. It's a huge resource site. I've been writing on it since 2008. A lot of times, one of the taglines I say is, head to exercisesforinjuries.com, enter in your injury or pain. There's a good chance I have an article, video, or interview that'll help you with your pain. Also, if you check out my YouTube channel, so on that exercisesforinjuries.com, there's well over 1,000 articles when it comes to injury and pain. If you go to my YouTube channel, there's well over 750 videos that will help you help you overcome your injury and pain. So, make sure to take a look at that site. It'll definitely help you, your colleagues, your friends, your family. So thank you very much, Alli, for the opportunity to chat with your audience.